Close your eyes and get comfortable. Tonight, we are traveling to the Pacific Ocean, to an expanse of water so vast it covers more of the Earth's surface than all of the land on the planet combined. An ocean of islands and atolls and jungle and coral reef, stretching from the frozen waters of Alaska in the north to the tropical heat of Australia in the south. From the western coast of the Americas all the way to the ancient shores of Asia. This is where one of the most dramatic and consequential military campaigns in human history was fought, the Pacific War. It was a war unlike anything the world had seen before or has seen since. Fought across millions of square miles of open ocean, decided by aircraft carriers and submarines and the courage of men on tiny islands whose names most people had never heard before and have largely forgotten since. It was a war that began with a sunrise and ended with a flash of light brighter than the sun itself. Tonight, we will tell that story from the beginning. There is no rush. Let the story carry you. To understand the Pacific War, we have to go back further than December 1941. We have to go back to the late 19th century and the extraordinary transformation of a nation that had spent centuries in deliberate isolation from the rest of the world. Japan. For over 200 years, Japan had been closed. The ruling Tokugawa shogunate had sealed the country from foreign influence in the early 1600s. No Japanese citizen could leave. No foreigner could enter. Trade was permitted only through a single small Dutch trading post on an artificial island in the harbor of Nagasaki. The rest of the world went about its business, and Japan went about its own, in magnificent, self-imposed isolation. Then, in July 1853, 4 American warships appeared in Edo Bay, the bay that is now Tokyo Bay, under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry. The ships were steam-powered and iron-hulled, and they carried guns the Japanese had never seen before. Perry delivered a letter from the President of the United States demanding that Japan open its ports to American trade. He said he would return the following year for an answer. He returned with 8 ships. Japan signed the Convention of Kanagawa in March 1854. The isolation was over. What followed was one of the most remarkable national transformations in recorded history. Japan looked at the Western powers that had forced their way into its waters and made a decision. If the West was powerful because of its industry and its technology and its modern military, then Japan would have all of those things. It would have them faster and better than anyone thought possible. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 ended the old feudal system and placed the Emperor Meiji at the head of a modernizing government determined to make Japan a world power. Japanese students were sent abroad to study Western science and law and military organization. Western advisors were brought to Japan to teach. Factories were built. Railways were laid. A modern army and navy were organized along Western lines. Within a single generation, Japan transformed itself from a feudal society into an industrial power. By 1905, Japan was strong enough to fight and defeat Russia, a major European power, in the Russo-Japanese War. It was the first time in the modern era that an Asian nation had defeated a European one. The world took notice. Japan took pride. And Japan took territory. Korea became a Japanese protectorate and then a colony. Manchuria came under increasing Japanese influence. The island of Taiwan was taken from China. With each acquisition, Japan's appetite grew, and the logic of empire, that strength required resources and resources required territory, became more deeply embedded in Japanese strategic thinking. By the 1930s, Japan was locked in a full-scale war with China. The Japanese military had become increasingly dominant in Japanese political life. Civilian governments were weak. Generals and admirals made policy. The ideology of Japanese racial and cultural superiority, the divine mission of the Japanese Empire to lead Asia under Japanese guidance, had taken hold at every level of society, and the resource problem had become acute. Japan was an island nation with almost no natural resources of its own. No oil, no rubber, no iron ore in meaningful quantities. Everything the Japanese war machine needed to keep running had to be imported. And the primary supplier of those imports was the United States. The relationship between Japan and America had been deteriorating for years. America disapproved of Japanese aggression in China. American public opinion was increasingly hostile to Japan. And in July 1941, after Japanese forces moved into French Indochina, modern Vietnam, the United States froze Japanese assets in America and imposed an oil embargo. Japan imported 80% of its oil from the United States. The embargo was a slow death sentence for the Japanese war machine. Japan's military leadership calculated that they had perhaps 18 months of oil reserves. After that, the fleet would be immobile. The aircraft would be grounded. The empire would wither. They made a decision. If war with America was coming anyway, and they believed it was, then it was better to strike first, strike hard. Strike while Japan still had the strength to fight. Destroy the American Pacific Fleet before it could be brought to bear. Then seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, and the rubber plantations of Malaya. Create a defensive perimeter so vast and so strongly held that America would eventually tire of the cost of breaking through it and agree to a negotiated peace that left Japan's empire intact. It was a plan of breathtaking ambition. It required everything to go right. Almost nothing did. The morning of December 7th, 1941, was a Sunday. At the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, the day was beginning slowly and peacefully in the way that Sunday mornings do. Sailors were sleeping in. Some were eating breakfast. The battleships of the Pacific Fleet sat at their moorings in the calm water of the harbor in long parallel rows. 7 battleships moored on Battleship Row. At 7:48 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over the mountains to the north. There were 183 of them. Fighters and torpedo bombers and dive bombers launched from 6 aircraft carriers that had sailed in complete radio silence across the northern Pacific, a route deliberately chosen for its remoteness and the fierce storms that discouraged other shipping. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. When it was over, the battleship Arizona had exploded and sunk, taking 1,177 of her crew with her. The Oklahoma had capsized. The California and West Virginia had sunk at their moorings. The Nevada had run aground after being struck by multiple bombs trying to escape the harbor. The Maryland, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania were damaged. 2,403 Americans were dead. 1,178 more were wounded. 188 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. It was the single greatest military disaster in American history. And yet, the Japanese had missed the most important targets in the harbor. The American aircraft carriers, the ships that would decide the Pacific War, were not at Pearl Harbor that morning. The Enterprise and Lexington were at sea on separate missions. The Saratoga was on the west coast of America. All 3 escaped. The fuel storage tanks at Pearl Harbor, holding 4.5 million barrels of oil that the entire Pacific Fleet depended on, were not attacked. If they had been destroyed, the fleet would have been forced to retreat to the American west coast, and the war in the Pacific might have gone very differently. The submarine base was not attacked either. American submarines would sink more Japanese shipping than all other causes combined. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood what had been missed, even as reports of the attack's success were coming in. He had studied in America. He had traveled widely. He understood American industrial power and American character in a way that few of his colleagues did. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant," he reportedly said, and filled him with a terrible resolve. He was right. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress. "Yesterday," he said, "December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Congress declared war on Japan within hours. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America was now fully in the war on both sides of the world." The months that followed Pearl Harbor were the darkest of the Pacific War for the Allied powers. Japan moved with stunning speed and efficiency across the Pacific and Southeast Asia in the weeks following the attack. Guam fell on December 10th. Wake Island fell on December 23rd, after a determined resistance by a small garrison of Marines who beat back an initial Japanese landing force before being overwhelmed by a second, larger assault. The Philippines, an American territory, were attacked on December 8th. Japanese forces landed in force on December 22nd. The American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur were pushed steadily back down the Bataan Peninsula into an increasingly desperate defensive perimeter. MacArthur was ordered by President Roosevelt to leave the Philippines and take command in Australia. He departed by PT boat in the middle of the night. "I shall return," he promised as he left. The defenders of Bataan held out until April 9, 1942, when they surrendered. The largest surrender of American forces since the Civil War. The prisoners were then subjected to the Bataan Death March, a forced march of 65 miles in brutal heat, without adequate food or water, in which thousands of American and Filipino prisoners died from exhaustion, disease, beatings, and murder by their captors. Corregidor, the island fortress in Manila Bay, held out until May 6, 1942. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, the British Empire was suffering catastrophic defeats. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 1941. Malaya fell after a brilliant Japanese campaign that covered 600 miles of jungle in 70 days. And then Singapore. Singapore was supposed to be the great fortress of the British Empire in Asia. It had enormous naval guns pointing out to sea. It was considered impregnable. The Japanese attacked from the north, through the jungle, on bicycles. Singapore fell on February 15, 1942. 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered to a Japanese force half their size. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Dutch East Indies fell. Burma fell. The Japanese had reached the borders of India, and they were pushing south toward Australia. On February 19, 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked the Australian city of Darwin in the largest foreign attack ever launched against Australian soil. 188 Japanese aircraft, more than had attacked Pearl Harbor, struck the harbor and the town, killing 235 people and sinking or damaging 30 ships. Australia was suddenly and terrifyingly aware that the war had come to them. The Japanese defensive perimeter now stretched from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the border of India in the west, to the island chains north and east of Australia in the south. It encompassed an area of the Pacific roughly the size of the continental United States. It seemed almost impossible to break through. Section 4. The turning of the tide. But the tide was already beginning to turn. On April 18, 1942, something happened that lifted American spirits in a way that was completely disproportionate to its actual military significance. Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25 bombers, medium bombers never designed to fly from aircraft carriers, off the deck of the USS Hornet. They flew 650 miles to Japan. They dropped bombs on Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, Nagoya, and Osaka. They caused minimal actual damage, but they had bombed Japan. They had reached the home islands themselves, the place that Japanese military doctrine said could never be touched. The psychological impact in Japan was enormous. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, then the defensive perimeter was not secure. Japan needed to push it further out, and that decision led directly to the battle that changed everything: Midway. The tiny atoll of Midway sits at the northwestern end of the Hawaiian island chain. It is barely 2 square miles of sand and coral and scrub vegetation in the middle of the vast Pacific. On a map, it looks like nothing at all. In June 1942, it became the most important piece of real estate on Earth. Admiral Yamamoto planned to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle by attacking Midway. He believed the American carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, would rush to defend the atoll and be destroyed by his vastly superior fleet. Japan would then control the Central Pacific, and America would be forced to negotiate. What Yamamoto did not know was that American codebreakers had broken the Japanese naval code. The Americans knew he was coming. Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz set his trap. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked Midway. American aircraft fought back. The battle seesawed back and forth in the early morning hours. Japanese aircraft were readying for a second strike on Midway. Japanese torpedo bombers on their carriers were being rearmed with bombs instead of torpedoes. Fuel lines were running across the flight decks. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked in the hangars below. Then the American dive bombers found them. In 5 minutes, 5 extraordinary minutes, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown dropped bombs onto 3 Japanese fleet carriers simultaneously: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu. All 3 were turned into blazing infernos by the explosions that tore through their fuel and ordnance-packed hangars. A 4th carrier, the Hiryu, survived the initial attack and launched a counterstrike that badly damaged the Yorktown. But the Hiryu was found and destroyed by American dive bombers later that afternoon. In a single day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Veteran pilots who could not be quickly replaced went down with their ships. The offensive power of the Japanese Navy was broken. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. It was won by codebreakers in basement offices in Hawaii, by dive bomber pilots who found their targets through a break in the clouds at precisely the right moment, by young men from Kansas and Ohio and California who had never seen the Pacific before 1941 and would never see it again after 1945. After Midway, the Americans went on the offensive. The strategy was called island hopping. Rather than attacking every Japanese-held island, there were hundreds of them, American forces would identify key islands, seize them, build airfields and supply bases, and use them as stepping stones to the next objective. Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands would be left to wither without supply or reinforcement. It was a strategy of ruthless efficiency, and it began at Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is a large jungle-covered island in the Solomon Islands chain northeast of Australia. In August 1942, American Marines landed on it, the first American offensive ground operation of the Pacific War. What followed was 6 months of some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war. The jungle was like nothing the American Marines had ever trained for. The heat was suffocating. The rain was relentless. Malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot killed and incapacitated as many men as Japanese bullets. The Marines lived on half rations for weeks at a time. They fought at night against Japanese soldiers who had been trained their entire military lives to fight in exactly these conditions. The naval battles around Guadalcanal were ferocious. Both sides lost cruisers and destroyers in night actions in the waters that came to be called Iron Bottom Sound for the ships that lay on its floor. But the Marines held Henderson Field, the airfield that was the strategic prize of the island. And in February 1943, the Japanese evacuated their remaining forces from Guadalcanal. It was the first Japanese ground defeat of the Pacific War. The island-hopping campaign moved through the Pacific in a great arc. New Georgia, Bougainville, the Gilbert Islands, Tarawa. Tarawa. The assault on Tarawa Atoll in November 1943 was one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The tiny island of Beshio, barely 2 miles long, was defended by 4,500 Japanese troops in a network of fortified bunkers and gun emplacements so strong that the Japanese commander had boasted it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to capture it. The Marines landed in 3 days of fighting that cost them 1,000 dead and 2,000 wounded. Almost the entire Japanese garrison of 4,500 men died. Only 17 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner. The lessons of Tarawa, the need for better amphibious tactics, better coordination between naval bombardment and landing forces, better equipment, were absorbed and applied to every subsequent landing. The Marshall Islands, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Palaleu, Leyte Gulf. Each island was a world of its own. Each had its own particular horror and its own particular courage. The Pacific War was fought in 3 dimensions simultaneously. On the ground, in the jungle. On the surface of the ocean, in great fleet engagements. And in the air and beneath the waves, in a relentless campaign of attrition that slowly strangled the Japanese Empire. American submarines were perhaps the most devastating single weapon of the Pacific War. Operating in waters that Japanese anti-submarine warfare struggled to control, American submarines hunted Japanese shipping with increasing effectiveness as the war progressed. Japan was an island nation. Everything it needed, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore, food, troops, ammunition, everything traveled by ship. American submarines found those ships and sent them to the bottom. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese ships faster than Japan could replace them. The tankers carrying oil from Southeast Asia were being sunk before they reached the home islands. The merchant ships carrying food were being sunk. Japan began to starve. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly and steadily as the submarine campaign tightened its grip. The submarine crews paid an enormous price. Submarine duty was the most dangerous assignment in the American military. 1 in 5 American submariners who served in the Pacific did not come home. 52 American submarines were lost. 3,500 submariners died. But they sank 1,314 Japanese merchant ships. They sank 201 Japanese warships. They reduced the Japanese merchant fleet from 6 million tons in 1941 to under 2 million tons by the end of the war. In the air, the Hellcat fighter, introduced in 1943, began to decisively outclass the Zero that had dominated the early war. American pilots were better trained. American industry was producing aircraft faster than Japanese industry could replace losses. The pool of experienced Japanese naval aviators, the men who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had sunk British battleships, who had swept across the Pacific in the early months of the war, was being steadily depleted in battles from Midway onward, and could not be replaced quickly enough. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 illustrated this starkly. American carriers and land-based aircraft shot down approximately 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days of fighting. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan was losing the air war. General Douglas MacArthur had promised to return to the Philippines. On October 20th, 1944, he waded ashore on the island of Leyte in the central Philippines. Camera crews filmed the moment. The tall general in his peaked cap and sunglasses walking through the surf onto the beach he had promised to reclaim. "People of the Philippines," he broadcast in his deep, resonant voice, "I have returned." The naval battle that accompanied the Leyte landing, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was the largest naval battle in history. It involved 367 ships, nearly 2,000 aircraft, and over 200,000 naval personnel from both sides. It lasted 4 days. Japan lost 3 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was the effective end of the Japanese Navy as a fighting force. During the battle, the Americans encountered for the first time in organized form a new Japanese tactic that would come to define the final phase of the Pacific War: the kamikaze. Kamikaze means divine wind, a reference to the typhoon that destroyed a Mongol invasion fleet threatening Japan in the 13th century. Kamikaze pilots were volunteers who agreed to fly their aircraft, loaded with explosives, directly into American ships. They were not suicide bombers in the modern sense. They were men who believed sincerely that their sacrifice would save their country. Many of them were very young. Many wrote farewell letters to their families the night before their missions. Between October 1944 and the end of the war, kamikaze attacks sank 34 American ships and damaged nearly 400 more. They killed approximately 5,000 American sailors. They also demonstrated to American military planners something deeply sobering. If Japan was willing to sacrifice its pilots by the hundreds in this way, if the Japanese military and population were willing to fight to the last person rather than surrender, then what would the invasion of the Japanese home islands look like? 2 battles in the final year of the war illustrated both the extraordinary courage of the men who fought in the Pacific and the terrible cost that an invasion of Japan itself would entail. Iwo Jima. The island of Iwo Jima is 8 square miles of volcanic rock and black sand in the western Pacific. It had almost no value except one. It had an airfield that American B-29 bombers needed for emergency landings on the long journey between the Mariana Islands and Japan. The Japanese garrison of 22,000 men had spent months fortifying the island. They had built 18 miles of tunnels connecting hundreds of bunkers and gun emplacements. They had positioned artillery to cover every inch of the beaches. Their commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had ordered his men not to die in banzai charges, but to fight from their fortifications and make the Americans pay for every foot of ground. The Marines landed on February 19, 1945. The battle lasted 36 days. When it was over, 6,800 Marines were dead, and nearly 20,000 were wounded. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest were dead. On the fifth day of the battle, a patrol of Marines climbed to the top of Mount Suribachi, the volcanic peak that dominated the island, and raised an American flag. A photographer named Joe Rosenthal captured the moment. The image, 6 men raising a flag on a rocky summit, became one of the most iconic photographs in American history. It was used on war bonds posters. It was made into a sculpture that stands outside Washington, D.C. to this day. Admiral Chester Nimitz said of the Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue. Okinawa was larger and bloodier still." Okinawa is a large island 340 miles south of the Japanese home island of Kyushu. Taking it would give American forces a base from which to launch an invasion of Japan itself. The battle lasted 82 days, from April 1st to June 22, 1945. The Japanese defense was ferocious. The civilian population of Okinawa was caught in the middle. Tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians died during the battle, some in the fighting, some ordered to commit suicide by Japanese military commanders rather than surrender. American casualties were staggering. 12,000 Americans killed, 38,000 wounded. 36 ships sunk, and 368 damaged by kamikaze attacks. The Japanese lost approximately 110,000 soldiers dead. The civilian death toll was perhaps 100,000 or more. American military planners looked at the casualty figures from Iwo Jima and Okinawa and projected them onto an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, was scheduled to begin in November 1945. Estimates of American casualties ranged from a few 100,000 to over 1 million. Japanese military and civilian casualties in an invasion of the home islands were projected to be in the millions. Something else was being considered. In the desert of New Mexico on July 16, 1945, the United States detonated the world's first nuclear device. The Manhattan Project, the secret program to develop an atomic bomb, had begun in 1942. It employed 130,000 people at its peak. It cost $2 billion. It was the largest and most expensive scientific and industrial project in human history to that point. The scientists who built the bomb were brilliant, and many of them were deeply ambivalent about what they had created. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the project, watched the explosion in the New Mexico desert and recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death," he said, "the destroyer of worlds." President Harry Truman, Roosevelt had died in April 1945, and Truman had taken office not knowing the bomb even existed, was informed of the successful test. he made the decision to use it against Japan. 2 cities were selected as targets, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Both were chosen because they were significant military and industrial centers that had not been heavily bombed, which would allow American analysts to accurately assess the bomb's effects. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named the Enola Gay dropped a single atomic bomb over the city of Hiroshima. The bomb detonated at 8:15 in the morning at an altitude of approximately 1,900 feet above the city. In an instant, a fireball hotter than the surface of the sun vaporized everything within a half-mile of the detonation point. A shockwave flattened buildings across 5 square miles. Fires broke out across the city simultaneously. Black rain contaminated with radioactive fallout, fell on the survivors. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll from the Hiroshima bombing, including those who died from radiation sickness in the weeks and months that followed, was between 90,000 and 166,000 people. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Between 60,000 and 80,000 people died. On August 8, 1945, between the 2 atomic bombs, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Japanese-held Manchuria with overwhelming force. Japan was facing destruction from multiple directions simultaneously. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made a radio broadcast. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard his voice. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he said, in the formal classical Japanese that many listeners struggled to understand. And moreover, the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. He was announcing the surrender. Japan had never surrendered in its recorded history. The concept was almost incomprehensible in Japanese military culture. Officers wept. Some committed suicide rather than accept it. But the emperor had spoken. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender ceremony was held aboard the USS Missouri, a battleship anchored in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided. Representatives of Japan signed the instruments of surrender at a table on the deck of the battleship. MacArthur signed on behalf of the Allied powers. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz signed for the United States. Above the deck, covering the spot where the ceremony took place, hung the American flag that had flown over the Capitol building in Washington on December 7, 1941, the day Pearl Harbor was attacked. After the signing, MacArthur spoke. "It is my earnest hope," he said, "and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." Above the harbor, hundreds of American aircraft flew in formation over the Missouri. Then hundreds more. The sky was filled with the sound of engines. The war in the Pacific was over. It had lasted 3 years, 8 months, and 23 days from the attack on Pearl Harbor to the deck of the Missouri in Tokyo Bay. In that time, the United States had built from almost nothing the most powerful naval and air force in history. It had projected military power across the largest ocean on Earth. It had fought on islands whose names, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, had meant nothing to most Americans before December 1941, and would mean everything to the families of the men who fought and died there. The human cost was staggering. American military deaths in the Pacific, approximately 111,000. Japanese military deaths, approximately 2.1 million. Japanese civilian deaths, estimates range from 500,000 to over 1 million, including those who died in the atomic bombings, in the firebombing campaigns that preceded them, and in the famine and disease that the collapse of the Japanese economy brought in the war's final year. The war in the Pacific remade the world. The old European colonial empires in Asia, British, French, Dutch, were fatally weakened and would not survive the decade. The United States emerged as the dominant power in the Pacific. Japan was occupied, reformed, and rebuilt, and would, within a generation, become one of the most successful economies in the world. The atomic bomb changed the nature of warfare and the nature of international relations forever. The world that emerged from the Pacific War was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before December 7th, 1941. Let the story of the Pacific War settle quietly around you now. The vast blue ocean stretching from horizon to horizon. The ships moving across it in the darkness. The young men on those ships, from Iowa and Georgia and California and Tokyo and Osaka, crossing the same water toward each other for reasons that had been decided by governments and histories and forces far beyond any of them. The islands rising from the sea, the jungle and the coral and the black volcanic sand. The courage that was asked of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and that was almost always given, on both sides of that terrible conflict. The Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the pen scratching across the paper, the aircraft filling the sky above the harbor, and then quiet. The guns silent at last across all that water. You are warm and safe and still. The story has been told. Let sleep come now. Good night.